You have no idea what it's like to see the man you love assault your beloved cousin hours before your wedding, then look you in the eye and smile as if nothing happened. My name is Charlotte Miller, though here in Riverdale Springs most people know me as Grandma Charlotte. I'm 83 now, with white hair always pulled into a tight bun and hands freckled with age spots that no cream could ever erase. When folks see me walking slowly across the town square, leaning on my hand-carved cane, they see a harmless old woman, perhaps a little fragile, maybe even sweet. What they don't see is the story I've carried in my chest for more than 60 years. A story so heavy, so raw that I buried it deep inside myself like a blade I dared not pull out. I thought silence would protect me. I thought burying the past would allow me to live. But silence cuts just as deep as truth, and I've reached the autumn of my life knowing I can't leave this world without telling you what happened on May 12, 1957, the day that should have been the happiest of my life. Instead, it became the day everything shattered. I grew up in Riverdale Springs, Virginia, back when it was just a cluster of cobblestone streets gathered around a small white church. My father, Joseph Miller, owned the town pharmacy. He wasn't just a shopkeeper. He mixed his own remedies and cared for folks when the doctor was out of town. My mother, Catherine, taught piano to the daughters of well-to-do families, and she sewed for extra money. We weren't wealthy, but we were respected. Our name meant something here. It was in my father's pharmacy that I first met Edward Thompson. It was a scorching January afternoon in 1955, and I was behind the counter helping while father made his deliveries. Edward stepped inside with a prescription for a headache, and I swear the air in that room changed. He was tall, elegant, with perfectly combed hair and striking green eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He wore a pale suit that looked far too fine for our little town. Edward had just arrived from Richmond to take over as the manager of the bank. His family was important, his father a banker with influence and money. He was educated, polite, and if you asked the ladies of Riverdale Springs, devastatingly handsome. Every unmarried girl in town blushed when he walked by. But that day in the pharmacy, his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than it should have, and I felt my cheeks flush hot as the sun outside. The following Sunday, he approached my mother and me after church. He asked permission to accompany us on our walk through the square. That's how our courtship began. Always supervised, always within the watchful eyes of Riverdale, as decency required in the 1950s. Edward was charming. He courted me with flowers, poetry books, and chocolates from the capital. He dined at our house every Sunday after service, and my parents welcomed him with proud smiles. Within 3 months, he had asked permission to court me formally. Within a year, he had asked for my hand. My mother whispered to me one evening, "Charlotte, you're the luckiest girl in town. A man like Edward comes once in a lifetime." And I believed her. Edward and I planned our future in detail. He was building us a 2-story home with a porch on Main Street, the most modern house Riverdale Springs had ever seen. It would have electricity in every room and even a private telephone, which was a luxury beyond imagining. We spoke of children. He wanted 3, I dreamed of 4. He promised to take me to New York City for our honeymoon. I was walking on clouds. The wedding was to be the grandest our town had ever seen. The entire community buzzed with excitement. The church was decorated with lilies and white orchids. The guest list stretched to over 200 people. My dress had been ordered from Richmond, lace and silk, so exquisite it cost 3 months of my father's salary. When I slipped the ring onto my finger, its tiny diamond caught the sunlight, and I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Then Helen arrived. My cousin from Norfolk. 18 years old, 2 years younger than me. She had long brown hair, soft eyes, and a quiet smile. We had been inseparable as children, writing letters back and forth after her family moved. When she stepped off the train 3 days before my wedding, I hugged her so tightly I thought I'd never let go. I wanted to tell her everything about Edward, about the dress, about the house that would soon be mine. I introduced her to Edward the next day. He was polite and attentive, asking about her studies, her hometown, making her feel welcome. Helen, always shy, answered softly, eyes lowered, her cheeks pink. I thought nothing of it. But over the following days something shifted. Helen began to avoid me. When I entered a room she would slip out. When I tried to talk about the wedding, she would answer with short, empty words. Her eyes seemed hollow, her smile strained. I asked her several times if something was wrong, and she insisted she was just tired. The night before the wedding, as tradition dictated, I stayed at my parents' house. Edward dined with his groomsmen, while Helen and the other girls helped me prepare. I remember watching her that night. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she adjusted my tiara. Finally, she grasped my hands in hers, her grip ice cold, her eyes burning into mine. "Are you sure, Charlotte?" she whispered. "Are you absolutely sure this is the man you want to spend your life with?" The question startled me. "Of course I'm sure." I laughed softly, though unease twisted in my stomach. "Edward is perfect. Why would you even ask that?" She shook her head, whispered that she was tired, and left me standing there, confused and unsettled. The next morning, the morning of my wedding, was chaos. My mother was rushing, the hairdresser and makeup artist buzzing around me, relatives coming and going. But somewhere in the midst of all that excitement, I noticed Helen was gone. My mother told me she had gone to retrieve something she had forgotten. I tried to brush off the unease creeping into my chest, and then just before noon I heard crying. Muffled broken sobs. I followed the sound to the guest room and found Helen sitting on the edge of the bed, her face hidden in her hands, her body trembling. My aunt knelt in front of her, whispering comforts that weren't working. When Helen lifted her head, I saw the bruise blooming on her cheek, the split in her lip, the blood-stained dress tossed on a chair. "What happened?" I demanded. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. The silence in that room was suffocating. My aunt tried to push me away, but I refused. I grabbed Helen's hands, cold and clammy in mine. "Tell me the truth." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it shattered my world. It was Edward. 2 words. Just 2 words, and everything collapsed. First I thought I'd misheard. My Edward? The man who had brought me flowers, who read me poetry, who built me a house. No. Impossible. But Helen's tear-filled eyes didn't lie. She told me how he came to the house that morning under the pretense of leaving me a gift, how he cornered her, how he wouldn't let her leave, how he covered her mouth to silence her cries. I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me, my ears rang like church bells. I wanted to scream, to tear the dress from my body, to run. Instead, I sat there frozen, staring at my cousin's broken face, realizing that the man waiting for me at the altar was not a husband, not a partner, not a gentleman. He was a monster. And in just a few hours, the whole town would gather to watch me marry him. But that wasn't going to happen. Not the way Edward expected. Because in that moment, beneath the crushing weight of betrayal and rage, I made a decision. If Edward Thompson thought he could ruin my cousin and walk into that church smiling, he was about to learn that I wasn't the meek, naive bride he believed me to be. And Riverdale Springs was about to witness the biggest scandal it had ever seen. I can still remember the sound of the wedding march echoing in that church, every note hitting me like a hammer against my chest. My arm was linked with my father's as we walked slowly down the aisle, the eyes of 200 guests fixed on me. For them it was a perfect day. A radiant bride in white lace, a proud father at her side, and a groom waiting at the altar with that confident smile. But for me, each step felt like walking toward fire. I could feel my father trembling. He knew the truth now. He had seen Helen's bruised face, heard her broken voice. He had begged me to cancel, to flee, to pretend I was ill. But I couldn't. Not after what Edward had done. Not after seeing Helen sobbing into her mother's lap, her life torn apart before it had truly begun. I wasn't just walking toward the altar that day. I was walking toward judgment. Toward the storm I was about to unleash. Edward stood there, tall and elegant, his green eyes sparkling, his lips curved into the smile that had once melted me but now made my stomach turn. He looked so sure of himself, so smug. He actually believed nothing could touch him. When I finally reached him, he extended his hand. "You look stunning," he whispered, his voice sweet as honey. I stared at that hand. The same hand that had struck Helen, silenced her, trapped her. Instead of taking it, I raised my veil slowly, my face hard as stone. My father moved to sit beside my mother. The guests leaned forward, expecting tears of joy, smiles, perhaps a blush. Instead, they saw my eyes cold with fury. "There will be no wedding today." My voice carried through the church like a thunderclap. The organist's hands froze on the keys. The pastor's mouth hung open. Gasps rippled through the pews. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Edward blinked, confusion flashing across his perfect face. Then a laugh, low, dismissive. Darling, you're nervous. Don't do this. Everyone's watching. Don't touch me. I recoiled as he reached for my arm. Don't ever put your hands on me again. A murmur swept through the church. I turned to face the crowd, my veil pushed back, my heart hammering so hard I thought my chest might burst. This morning, I said, my voice trembling but loud. The man you all see before you, this respectable banker, this so-called gentleman, assaulted my cousin Helen. He forced himself on her. He hurt her. He humiliated her. And now he stands here smiling, ready to marry me as if nothing happened. Gasps. Cries of disbelief. The room erupted in whispers, women clutching their daughters' hands, men shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Edward's face turned pale, then red with fury. She's lying, he shouted, his voice cracking. She's hysterical. She's jealous of her own cousin. Can't you see? She wants me for herself. Enough. I snapped louder than I thought possible. The side door opened. Miss Eugenia appeared, guiding Helen into the church. My cousin's face was still swollen, her lips split, the bruise stark against her pale skin. The sight silenced the room instantly. Behind her came my aunt and uncle, their expressions stricken with shame and grief. Look at her, Edward. I spat, pointing at Helen. Look at what you've done. But he didn't. He kept his eyes on me, green irises burning with hatred. Whispers filled the church like a rising storm. Helen stood tall beside me, her eyes downcast, but her very presence screamed the truth. Edward's father, the powerful banker from Richmond, rose from his seat near the front, his face red with rage. This is slander, he barked. My son is a respectable man. These are lies. Charlotte, do you know what you're doing? You're destroying your own reputation, your family's good name with this nonsense. But before he could continue, a woman's voice rang out from the back of the church. It's not the first time. The entire congregation turned. It was Mary, Edward's housekeeper, a sturdy woman in her 40s who had worked for him since his arrival. She walked slowly down the aisle, her voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. It's not the first time Mr. Thompson has done this. I've seen it before. The blacksmith's daughter. The baker's niece. Girls too frightened to speak. I kept quiet because I was afraid of losing my job. But I won't keep quiet anymore. The church erupted into chaos. Women gasped in horror. Men shouted, some at Edward, others at Mary, demanding proof. Mothers pulled their daughters close, holding them tightly as if shielding them from the very air. Edward lunged forward, his mask finally cracking. You liar. You meddling witch. His voice shook with fury. He moved as if to strike her. But the pastor stepped between them, raising his hand. Enough, he thundered. And then the heavy doors at the back of the church burst open. Sheriff Miller strode in, broad-shouldered and stern, with 2 deputies at his side. The murmur died instantly. The sheriff's boots echoed on the stone floor as he walked down the center aisle, his mustache bristling, his hand on his holster. Edward Thompson, his voice boomed. You are under arrest for questioning on allegations of assault and violence against women. Edward froze, his arrogance crumbling into panic. His father sputtered, shouting about influence and lies, but the sheriff ignored him. Edward looked at me, his face twisted in rage, his voice low but venomous. You'll regret this, Charlotte. You'll regret it for the rest of your life. I lifted my chin, meeting his gaze. No, Edward. The only thing I regret is not seeing the monster behind that smile sooner. The deputies moved in. Edward resisted, struggling, shouting, but they forced his hands behind his back. The sight of him being dragged out of the church, his hair disheveled, his once perfect suit wrinkled and stained with sweat, it was the undoing of every illusion he had ever spun. But as he passed me, his eyes met mine again, and I swear there was something there, something darker than rage. Promise. A warning. The church was in uproar, the ceremony shattered. Guests whispered, some openly weeping, others glaring at me as though I had ruined the day, not the man being dragged away in shackles. My father stood by me, his hand firm on my shoulder, but I felt the weight of the town stairs pressing down like 1,000 stones. In the midst of that chaos, Helen clutched my hand, whispering through her tears, Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you. I squeezed her hand back, though my own was trembling. Because in that moment, even as Edward was taken away, even as the scandal rocked Riverdale Springs to its core, I knew this wasn't the end. Edward Thompson might be gone from the church that day, but he wasn't gone from my life. Not yet. And deep inside me I felt it. The storm he would unleash had only just begun. You might think that once Edward was dragged out of that church in handcuffs, my story ended. That I could breathe again, wipe the tears from my cousin's cheeks, and rebuild my life with peace in my heart. But life, my dear listeners, is never so merciful. The truth is, the arrest was only the beginning. When the sheriff's deputies pulled Edward through those church doors, the congregation didn't erupt in cheers or applause. No. What filled the air was something far heavier. Confusion, disbelief, judgment. Some looked at me with pity, others with contempt. I could feel their eyes drilling into my back as I stood at the altar in my wedding gown, lace sleeves trembling against my skin. The bouquet slipped from my hands and hit the stone floor with a hollow thud. It sounded like the closing of a coffin. My mother rushed forward to hold me, her hands cold with shock. My father stayed by the pastor, trying to calm the guests, but it was no use. Riverdale Springs had just witnessed its greatest scandal, and there was no silencing 200 tongues. They'll never forget this. My mother whispered into my ear, her voice cracking. They'll never forgive us. And she was right. By the time the sun set that day, the whispers had turned into full-fledged stories. I was the poor delusional bride, standing humiliated at the altar. Helen was painted either as a tragic victim or, by some cruel mouths, a jealous liar who wanted to destroy my happiness. And Edward? To half the town, he remained the charming banker, the good catch, the man who had been set up by two foolish girls who didn't know better. The other half, the women mostly, looked at me with gratitude in their eyes, though few dared to say anything aloud. That evening, our house was filled not with celebration, but with silence. The food that had been prepared for the reception went untouched. The cake with its delicate sugar roses sat in the club's hall wasted. My dress still clung to me like a shroud. I couldn't bring myself to remove it. I sat on my bed staring at the mirror, the veil pulled at my feet like a ghost of the life I just buried. Helen sat beside me, her hand in mine. She hadn't stopped crying. I hadn't stopped shaking. Why didn't you just run away with him? She whispered suddenly. I turned to her, stunned. If you had married him, I'd have been ruined, yes. But you would still have your reputation, your place in this town. I cupped her face in my hands. Helen, do you think I could ever live with myself knowing what he did to you? Knowing I let him destroy you just to protect my own comfort? No. I'd rather be ruined 100 times than be his wife for one day. She broke down again, sobbing against my shoulder. But even as I held her, I knew she was right about one thing. I had ruined myself. The next morning, the sheriff came to our home. He removed his hat respectfully as he stood in our parlor, the floorboards creaking beneath his heavy boots. Miss Charlotte, he said, his mustache twitching as he cleared his throat. I thought you ought to know. Edward's father posted bail. He's back at his house. My blood ran cold. What do you mean back? I asked. He assaulted Helen. He should be locked away. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. The law moves slow. And his family, well, they've got influence. Connections in Richmond. It'll take more than one accusation to keep him in jail. I felt Helen flinch beside me. The sheriff lowered his voice. I'm not saying the case won't stick, but you and your cousin ought to be careful. Men like Edward, they don't take kindly to being exposed. And he was right. The days that followed were a blur of shame and fear. When I walked through town with my mother, shopkeepers whispered. Some women turned their backs. Others, quietly, pressed notes into my hand, words of support they were too afraid to say aloud. Edward, meanwhile, carried himself as though nothing had happened. He still walked through the square in his pressed suits, his head high, that smirk tugging at his lips. Only now, when his eyes met mine across the street, I saw something darker there. A threat. One afternoon, as Helen and I left the general store, a note slipped from my basket. Folded neatly, pressed into the side of my bag without my noticing. I opened it in the street. My hands trembled as I read the words written in an elegant but furious hand. "You've made a mistake, Charlotte. You think you've won, but this town will turn on you. And when they do, no one will believe a word you say. Not even about me." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. That night, my father locked all the doors and windows. My mother insisted Helen sleep in my room. I lay awake, listening to the sound of her breathing beside me, the shadows on the wall stretching like claws. I told myself I had done the right thing. I had exposed a monster. I had saved other women from his violence. But in the quiet darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. And then came the retaliation. 2 days later, the Riverdale Gazette ran a story, not about Edward's arrest, not about Helen's testimony, not even about Mary the housekeeper's confession. No. The headline read, "Banker's son falsely accused in jealous plot." The article described me as an unstable young woman, a jilted bride who concocted a scheme with her cousin to humiliate an innocent man. It painted Edward as a victim of female hysteria, a hard-working gentleman cruelly slandered on his wedding day. The words made me sick. But worse than the words were the looks. The way townsfolk eyed me in the square, their whispers sharp as knives. Helen, poor Helen, couldn't even leave the house. When she tried, children pointed at her bruises and repeated what their mothers had said. Liar. I began to understand that Edward didn't need to raise a hand against us anymore. He had the power of his name, his father's money, the newspaper, and the cowardice of a town too afraid to face the truth. One night, as I sat by the window, staring at the empty street, my father came to me. He laid a hand on my shoulder. His voice was low, tired. "Charlotte," he said, "we may need to leave Riverdale. For your sake. For Helen's. This town, they won't forgive what you've done. Even if you were right. Leave." I whispered. "This is our home. Home doesn't mean much if it becomes a prison." I pressed my forehead to the glass, tears blurring the street lamps outside. He was right. But leaving meant giving Edward what he wanted, silence. And I swore I would never give him that satisfaction. Still, that night, as the clock struck midnight, I heard something that chilled me to my core. A knock at the door. Slow. Deliberate. My father rushed to the porch with his shotgun, but when he opened the door, the street was empty. Only a single envelope lay on the step. Inside was a photograph of me, taken without my knowledge, walking through the square in my wedding dress on that cursed day. On the back, in that same elegant script, were 4 words. "This isn't over, Charlotte." And in my heart I knew. The real battle hadn't even begun. The morning after that photograph appeared on our doorstep, I woke with a knot in my stomach so tight it hurt to breathe. I had dreamed of Edward's eyes. Those piercing green eyes that once made me blush now haunted me like the eyes of a predator. When I sat up in bed, Helen was already awake, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest. She hadn't spoken much since that night at the church. She stared at the walls as if she expected Edward to walk through them. "Charlotte," she whispered, her voice so thin it barely reached me. "He's not going to stop." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that justice would come, that men like Edward couldn't hide behind their money forever. But even as the words formed in my throat, I knew they'd be lies. Because already the tide was turning against us. By the end of that week, the Gazette ran another story, this time quoting unnamed sources who claimed Edward had been pursued by me. A desperate young woman infatuated with a man out of her reach. They said I had tricked him into proposing, that I had staged the whole spectacle out of bitterness, because deep down I knew he didn't love me. It was poison, every word of it, and people drank it eagerly. Neighbors who once greeted me kindly now crossed the street when they saw me coming. Women whispered when I passed them in the market, their hands covering their mouths but their eyes sharp as knives. Some even smirked. And the men? Oh, the men shook their heads, muttering about girls with wild imaginations, and how dangerous it was to ruin a man's good name with gossip. It was as if they all wanted to believe Edward because the truth, that one of their most respected men was a predator, was too ugly to bear. One afternoon I was walking with Helen to the bakery when Mrs. Thompson, Edward's mother, stepped out of the milliner's shop. She wore her pearls, her hair immaculate, her face arranged into that same condescending smile I remembered from when Edward first courted me. "Well," she said, loud enough for everyone in the square to hear, "if it isn't our little actress." Shame the theater in Richmond didn't discover you before this scandal. You'd have made quite a career out of lies. The laughter that followed cut me deeper than any blade. Helen trembled beside me, tears filling her eyes, but I stood tall even as my heart cracked in two. I may be ruined, I told her quietly, but I will never be a liar. She gave me a look of pure disdain and swept past us, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air like poison. That night Helen broke down again. They're winning, Charlotte. He's winning. Everyone believes him. They'll never believe me. I should have stayed silent. I grabbed her shoulders so tightly she gasped. Don't you ever say that again. If you had stayed silent, he would have hurt more women. He would have destroyed more lives. You saved someone even if it was just me. And I will not let him bury the truth. But in the quiet after my words, even I wondered if I could keep that promise. Because Edward wasn't just fighting with lies and whispers. He was fighting with power. 2 weeks after the ruined wedding, my father came home from the pharmacy pale and shaken. Charlotte, he said, they're cutting off our supplies. The distributor in Richmond, Edward's father leaned on them. They claim it's just a business decision, but I know what it is. They want to starve us out. And it didn't stop there. Our piano students began canceling their lessons with my mother. Too much shame in that household, one woman muttered as she yanked her daughter away from our porch. My mother's eyes burned with humiliation, but she forced a brave smile until the girl was gone. We were being strangled slowly, deliberately. One evening, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. I built this life with my own 2 hands, he whispered. And now because of him it's all crumbling. And for what? For telling the truth? I touched his arm gently. For justice, father. But even as I said it, I felt how fragile the word sounded. Justice. Like glass about to shatter. And then the threats grew bolder. It started with the photograph on the doorstep. Then came the dead bird left on our porch, its wings twisted cruelly. After that, a brick through the pharmacy window in the middle of the night. My father chased the shadowy figures into the dark, but they were gone before he reached the street. Finally, one night as Helen and I prepared for bed, we heard it, scratching at the window. Slow. Deliberate. I pulled back the curtain, my heart in my throat, and there it was. A single word carved into the glass with a knife. Liar. Helen screamed. My father rushed into the room with his shotgun. But the street outside was silent, empty, the shadows thick with menace. I knew then that Edward wasn't going to stop until I was broken. Until we all were. And yet, somewhere deep inside me something hardened. They wanted me to cower. They wanted me to run. But if I had survived that church, survived watching my dream turn into a nightmare in front of 200 people, then I could survive this too. I told myself, if Edward wants a war, then he'll have it. The very next morning, I walked into the sheriff's office with Helen by my side. My hands trembled but my voice was steady. We want to press charges, I told him. Not just accusations whispered in church aisles. Not just rumors in the street. We want the law to hear us. The sheriff looked at me with pity in his eyes. Charlotte, I can take your statement and I will. But the judge, he's close with the Thompsons. This won't be easy. Nothing about this has been easy, I said. Write it down. Helen's voice shook as she recounted what Edward had done. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't falter. I held her hand through every word. When it was over, the sheriff set down his pen. It's going to get uglier before it gets better, he warned. I met his eyes. It's already ugly. At least now it'll be on the record. That night, as Helen slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I knew Edward wouldn't forgive me for this. He would strike back harder than ever. But I also knew something else. He had underestimated me. I wasn't just a ruined bride anymore. I wasn't just a girl in a white dress humiliated at the altar. I was a woman with nothing left to lose. And that, my dear listeners, is the most dangerous kind of woman there is. Because when you've already lost everything, you stop being afraid. And I could feel it in my bones. Edward's next move was coming. And when it did, I would be ready. I can still hear the sound of the gavel in that tiny courtroom. A sound sharp enough to slice through bone. It echoed in my ears for weeks afterward, not because it meant justice was being served, but because it meant the opposite. The Thompsons had bought the judge before we even walked in. Helen and I gave our testimonies. I spoke with fire in my chest, every word from my mouth a blade. Helen, fragile but brave, recounted her nightmare with trembling hands. The sheriff vouched for us. Mary the housekeeper repeated her damning story. Even the Smith's daughter, pale and shaking, showed up to tell the truth. But when Edward walked in wearing his tailored gray suit, his father by his side, the room tilted against us. He smiled at the jury as though they were old friends. He shook hands with the judge before the hearing began. And then his lawyer, oh, that snake in human skin, ripped us apart piece by piece. Miss Miller, he said, his voice slick as oil, you were spurned at the altar, were you not? Jilted. Embarrassed. You've invented a story to punish Mr. Thompson for humiliating you in front of the entire town. My fists clenched so hard my nails dug crescents into my palms. I didn't invent anything, I spat. He assaulted my cousin. He ruined her. Or perhaps your cousin, desperate for attention, decided to concoct a fantasy. After all, who would turn down the most eligible bachelor in Riverdale? The jury murmured. The lawyer smirked. By the time the session ended, Edward hadn't even spoken. He didn't have to. His silence was power enough. The gavel struck, and the judge dismissed the case for insufficient evidence. I remember Helen collapsing into my arms outside the courthouse. She sobbed until her body gave out. My father cursed under his breath, his face red with shame and fury. Mary walked away, shoulders sagging, muttering, I knew they wouldn't listen. And Edward? He stepped onto the courthouse steps as if he were the victor of some parade. Flashbulbs from the Gazette camera popped, catching his triumphant smile, his father's proud stance, and me broken, clutching Helen as though I could shield her from a world that had already chosen its side. That night, Riverdale Springs divided itself in two. Half the town cheered Edward, convinced he was a poor man smeared by jealous women. The other half whispered support for me and Helen, but whispered was all they dared. Because speaking louder meant risking their jobs, their farms, their safety. And no one wanted to face the wrath of the Thompsons. For weeks I lived in shadows. Strangers spat near my shoes as I walked by. Anonymous letters slid under our door, filled with words I cannot repeat aloud. My father's pharmacy nearly went bankrupt. My mother stopped leaving the house altogether. Helen barely spoke at all. There were nights when I lay awake and asked myself if it would have been better if I had stayed silent, if I had just married Edward, swallowed the horror, and pretended life was perfect. Wouldn't it have been easier? But then I would look at Helen's face in the moonlight, bruises still fading, her spirit dimmed, and I knew silence was a death worse than any scandal. I had lost the courtroom, but I refused to lose myself. And then, just when despair threatened to swallow me whole, help came from the unlikeliest corner. It was a Thursday morning when I found the note tucked inside a stack of newspapers at the pharmacy counter. No name, just a single sentence written in careful slanted handwriting. Meet me behind St. Mary's Chapel at dusk. I have something you need. My first thought was a trap. Edward's trap. But something about the neatness of the handwriting, the subtle urgency, it didn't feel like his venom. It felt different. So at dusk, with my heart pounding, I walked to the chapel. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and purple, the air heavy with the smell of lilacs. Behind the church, standing in the shadow of the old oak, was Mary, Edward's housekeeper. She looked tired, older than I remembered, her hands twisted in front of her apron. Miss Charlotte, she said softly, I've been keeping something I should have shown you sooner. From inside her pocket, she pulled out a small notebook, its leather cover worn thin. I found this while cleaning his house, she explained. I shouldn't have touched it, but I did. And once I read it, I couldn't keep it to myself. Not anymore. She placed it in my hands. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside, page after page, in Edward's own handwriting, were notes. Names. Dates. Descriptions. The baker's niece. The Smith's daughter. A maid in Richmond. And then Helen. My Helen. I felt sick. But I also felt something else. Vindication. This is proof, I whispered, clutching the book. This will destroy him. Mary nodded, tears filling her eyes. But be careful. If he knows you have it, he'll stop at nothing to get it back. For the first time in weeks, a spark lit inside me. We had lost the trial, yes. But now we had his secrets, written in his own cursed hand. That night I showed the notebook to Helen. She recoiled as though it burned her. I can't look at it. You don't have to, I told her. But I will. And I'll use every word in here to end him. The next morning, I walked into the Gazette office with the notebook clutched under my arm. The editor, Mr. Jennings, looked at me with tired eyes. Charlotte, I can't risk another lawsuit. Edward's father. I slammed the notebook on his desk, opened to the page with Helen's name. Then print the truth. In his own words. Or tell me you've sold your soul to the Thompsons. His hand shook as he turned the pages. His face went pale. He closed the notebook slowly, like a priest handling scripture. You've just handed me dynamite, he whispered. And once I light the fuse, there's no putting it out. Then light it, I said. And he did. The Gazette's Sunday edition exploded across Riverdale Springs like a thunderclap. Headline in bold letters. Banker's son exposed. Private journal reveals dark secrets. People devoured every word. The names, the dates, the chilling descriptions Edward himself had scrawled. His mask of respectability shattered overnight. But victory, my dear listeners, is never clean. Because the morning the paper hit the stands, Edward vanished. The sheriff searched. Men combed the countryside. His father raged like a wounded lion, screaming about conspiracies. But Edward was gone, leaving only that smirk burned into my memory and a question that chilled me to my core. Where had he gone? And more terrifying, what would he do when he came back? Edward's disappearance left Riverdale Springs trembling like a town standing on a fault line. For weeks, no one knew where he had gone. Rumors swirled. He'd fled to Richmond. He'd boarded a train west. He'd drowned himself in the river. Every whisper carried a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that he was gone. Dread that he might return. And he did. It was late summer, a blistering August evening, when Edward Thompson came back to town. I remember it clearly because the heat was so heavy that the cricket song sounded like screams. I was in the kitchen, helping my mother cool jars of preserves, when my father burst through the door, his face pale. He's back, he said simply. Helen dropped the spoon in her hand. It clattered against the floor. She pressed herself into the wall like a cornered animal. What do you mean back? I asked, though my stomach already knew the answer. They saw him at the bank. Walked in as if nothing ever happened. Smiling. Shaking hands. My father's voice broke with anger. The devil himself could not look more alive. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my heart slam against my ribs. I lay awake, clutching the wooden crucifix my mother placed in my hand. Somewhere in the dark, I swore I could feel him watching me. 2 days later the letters began. Slipped under the door, left in the garden, even hidden inside our mailbox between the bills. All written in that same familiar slant. You ruin me, but you'll never escape me. One day you'll be mine again, Charlotte. You think you've won? You haven't seen what I can take from you yet. Each note was a serpent coiling tighter around my neck. The sheriff warned us to stay vigilant, but there was little he could do without catching Edward in the act. He's clever, the sheriff muttered, frustration in his eyes. Clever and protected. And then Edward escalated. One night I awoke to the smell of smoke. Panic ripped through me as I bolted upright. Our barn was on fire. My father and brothers rushed out with buckets, neighbors came running. But by the time the flames died down, everything inside, tools, hay, feed, was ash. Helen stood in the yard, shaking violently, whispering, "He's going to kill us, Charlotte. He won't stop until we're all dead." I held her close. I whispered fierce lies I didn't even believe. "We'll be fine. He won't win." But inside, I felt as if the ground beneath me was crumbling inch by inch. The breaking point came one September evening. I was walking home from the church when I felt it. Footsteps behind me. Slow. Deliberate. My skin prickled. The sun had already dipped below the hills, the world cloaked in blue twilight. I turned a corner and there he was. Edward. Leaning against a lamppost, as calm as if we were meeting for a stroll. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes still burned with that terrifying hunger. "Charlotte," he said softly, like we were old lovers meeting in secret. My runaway bride. My throat went dry. Stay away from me. He chuckled, pushing off the post, walking closer. You humiliated me. Destroyed me. But you know what, darling? You still want me. I can see it in your eyes. Touch me and I'll scream, I warned. He tilted his head, smiling that wolfish grin. Scream then. Let the whole town come. They'll see a broken girl still obsessed with the man she couldn't have. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stand tall. You can't scare me anymore, Edward. You can burn barns, you can send letters, but you'll never own me. Never. His smile faltered. For the first time I saw a crack in his mask. Rage flickered across his face. He stepped forward, raising his hand, and then the shout came. Step away from her. It was the sheriff, his shotgun leveled, with 2 deputies at his side. Edward froze, his jaw tightening, his hand curling into a fist at his side. For a moment I thought he'd lunge at me anyway. But then slowly he dropped his arm. The deputies seized him. He didn't resist. He only smiled at me, lips curling in a promise that chilled my blood. You think this is over? He whispered as they dragged him away. But you'll carry me with you until the day you die. And damn him, he was right. Edward Thompson was finally taken out of Riverdale Springs, tried again with the journal as evidence this time, the weight of his own words too heavy to ignore. This time the court couldn't look away. Too many victims came forward. Too many voices joined together. He was sentenced, locked away. But his shadow never left me. For years afterward, I flinched at green eyes in a crowd. I jumped when footsteps echoed behind me. Even after I married another man, kind, gentle, patient, I sometimes woke screaming in the night. My husband would hold me, whispering that I was safe. But I never truly believed it. Helen never married. She carried her silence like a cloak, retreating from the world. We remained close, but there was always a part of her locked away. A part Edward had stolen forever. As for me, I built a life. Children, grandchildren, Sunday dinners. From the outside, perhaps I seemed like any other woman who had aged into a gentle grandmother. But inside there was always the wound. Always the memory of that May afternoon in 1957, when the world showed me just how cruel it could be. And now here I am, 83 years old. My hair white, my hands wrinkled, my cane carved with care by one of my grandsons. People see me as harmless, sweet, just Grandma Charlotte. But I carry this story like a scar across my soul. I tell it now not for pity, but because silence is what men like Edward count on. Silence is their weapon. So I break mine. If you're listening to me, if you've made it this far, remember this. Evil doesn't always come in the form of monsters in the dark. Sometimes it wears a handsome smile, a pressed suit, and green eyes that make young girls blush. Sometimes it sits in the front pew at church, or behind the counter at the bank. And if you ever find yourself doubting what you've seen, doubting what you've heard, doubting your own truth, don't. Because I doubted. And it almost destroyed me. Edward Thompson is gone from this world now, buried in a grave far from Riverdale Springs. But he was right about one thing. I carry him with me. In every tremor of my hands, in every nightmare that jolts me awake, in every warning I give my grandchildren when I tell them, never ignore the shadows, my darlings. They have teeth. And that, dear listeners, is the truth I've held for more than 60 years. The truth I can only hope will outlive me.